Hello everyone. We're going to do a quick run through of how to do the battery settings on the MidnitePro app. We've already logged into our app with our installer account and we've got a list of our inverters. So we're going to go to one of these inverters. And here you can see the inverter. We click on it to go into the inverter. Go to our status screen. We'll scroll down to settings. Now battery, and here are our battery settings. We have our battery brand selection. When using the Midnight batteries, this should always be Midnight battery. You don't need to adjust the communication address. Capacity type will be state of charge. You should generally always use state of charge when doing closed loop with batteries. If you're doing open loop with a lithium battery that does not have communication, or with a lead acid battery, you'll want to set this to voltage type. Here we've got our discharge and charge 2%. And we can set these right here. The charge 2% should always be 100%. We want to charge all the way up. Our discharge 2%, that is where the inverter shuts off from low battery. The battery itself will shut off at a lower voltage, and when the battery itself shuts off, we may need a manual restart of the system. So we want to shut off the inverter before we get down there. We can run the batteries down really close to 0%, but I usually recommend 20% for our discharge 2 setting. That gives a nice safe buffer at the bottom in case our state of charge has drifted a little bit from reality. That can happen if we're not getting up to 100% every few days to recalibrate the BMS. So 15 or 20% on the low end is a good setting for our discharge 2%. Recovery charging. This is if we're connected to the grid and we've got our other settings such that we would not be charging the battery from the grid. If the battery drains down to that level, it will do a slow recharge just to top the battery off a little bit. Our discharge and SOC on grid. This is only relevant if we're doing a grid connected system. If we're off grid, it doesn't matter. But when we're doing a grid connected system, this is the maximum it'll draw down the power if we're doing self-consumption for time of use or other purposes before reconnecting the loads to the grid. We can set this anywhere between where the inverter shuts off, which we had set to 20% up above, or all the way up to 95%. We don't want to set it all the way at 100%, even if we're trying to keep our batteries topped off all the time, because we want them to cycle just a little bit so that they know to recharge and recalibrate the batteries each day. So if we're doing, say, a grid-tied system where we're just doing battery backup, we want to set it for self-consumption and set our discharge and SOC on grid to 95%. So each night it'll go down just a little bit and know to recharge and recalibrate the next day. If we're doing time of use, we might set it to use much more than that each day. We could set it at 20% and then it'll go all the way down to 20% before switching back to grid power. We've got our maximum charge power and maximum discharge power. These we can set at lower values. 10,000 watts is the maximum that a single inverter can do, but we could set them at lower values if we don't want to be running that hard. If we have a single power flow 16 battery, generally we want to keep this at 8,000 watts or less. If we have multiple batteries, it could be higher. And then here, our maximum grid recovery charge power. That's the power that it uses to charge during that recovery charge if it gets low and it's connected to the grid. And this is usually a low rate because all we are trying to do is top it off a little bit rather than doing a full charge. Charge by grid enables or disables charging from the grid, whether we want to charge from the grid or just solar. Charge by grid here. Stop charging by battery capacity. This is when we're charging by the grid. How high do we want to take it? Maximum allowed charging power when we're charging from the grid. This can be different than the maximum charge power up above if maybe we want to charge at full power from solar, but if we're charging from the grid, we only want to charge at a reduced rate to not incur some peak demand charges perhaps. Here's an important one. Minimum initiation startup battery capacity when off-grid. This is kind of the reconnect if we've done a disconnect. We've hit that 20% where we shut off. This is where the inverter turns back on after the batteries recharge a bit. You want to have a little bit of space here so you don't oscillate between turning on and off quickly. 5% is probably good. 10% is better. Give the batteries a little chance to recover. But if your inverter has shut off and it hasn't turned back on yet, this is one place to look at this setting. Has it recharged up to this point to turn back on? And then down here at the bottom, force charging. This one essentially overrides most of the other settings under power control for whether we're charging from the grid or a generator, and maybe we've got some other settings that would normally not be charging from that source, but we just want to top off the battery. This can often be the case where we've disabled charging from the grid because we're doing time of use and we want to wait for the solar to recharge the battery the next morning rather than recharging from the grid. But maybe we've got a storm coming and we want to top the batteries off to 100% to be ready for a possible backup power situation from the storm. We can hit force charging and it'll charge up to 100%. And that's our battery settings in the app.